the way to approach any of this kind of material, or anybody who's lecturing on spiritual stuff and internal dynamics and things like that, the only way to really approach it is not through a focused or a sharp focused mind, but through a relaxed awareness, to actually settle the mind down and rest back into yourself, into that quiet space that we all have. And that's where you see, and that's where you gather the most information, the most awareness. And so there's a point I've got to make about a relaxed awareness. A relaxed awareness doesn't mean going to sleep or becoming comatose. That's the other thing that people commonly mistake, because usually when we relax or we rest, our tiredness comes up, and we kind of signal ourselves to go to sleep or to recharge. But a relaxed awareness is kind of like it's a passive state of awareness that gets overlooked in common day-to-day activity. We get so caught up in the mind and the movements of the mind and our thoughts and what our thoughts are doing, what we're thinking and what we're focused on, that we sort of overlook the more receptive frame of mind. Our thinking is good for clarifying certain subjects, and when we need to focus, and when we're reading something, the mind operates kind of like a camera in that sense, in that when we focus and when we're thinking.
Oh, sorry, that's right.
When we're thinking, the mind is sharp. We sharpen, and sort of in the Western world, through our education and just through our general social conditioning, we're taught that to be a person who concentrates and who has a sharp mind and a sharp awareness. And we're not sort of taught so much about the other state of mind. So we sort of drift off into this thought-filled reality rather than more a passive awareness. Because passive awareness is about being open to a wider angle view of reality. In class I've talked about how like early on, sorry, I'll step back a sec. Early on, I was working with the mind, the emotions, and all of these kinds of things, and it really bugged me that that I had these qualities that I had to deal with, but I had no concept of them and what exactly they meant. I had no model to work with. So the best model I came up with over the time was that consciousness is kind of like a beach. And why it's like a beach is because if you imagine that you step out onto the sand of your own private beach, there's nobody else on this beach, and that as far as the eye can see, the beach goes off in either direction into the horizon. And when you step out onto the beach, you can feel the warmth of the sand and the sun coming down, and you can hear the birds flying across the sky, and you can hear the water lapping on the shore. And when you step out onto that beach of consciousness, you're totally open, you're totally aware, your senses aren't really focused on any one particular detail, you're just open and aware. And so you're taking all the information about the space. You're taking the warmth of the sand and the sounds and all of the different aspects of the space, the colours of the sky. And you're not in a space of thinking, you're in a space of just being. And so when you step out onto that beach and you become aware of the space, well, you can do anything you like with the space because nobody's there, nobody's crowding you, and it's your private beach. And so in that moment of awareness, of self-awareness, you can do anything. You're not conditioned, you're free. You can do whatever you want with the space. So let's imagine for a second that you want to build a sandcastle. And so you start walking down to the shore where the sand is wet, and you start building and patting the sandcastle and making a sculpture, and in that moment, in that thought that you had to create a sandcastle, in your concentration on building the sandcastle and patting the sand and building it up and dig the little moat and put the little flag on the top, in that moment of concentrating, what you've literally done is that you've screened out all of the details that don't belong to the thing you're thinking about. There's just the sandcastle. And the longer you spend building your sandcastle, the more detail you can build into it, and it becomes very detailed in your mind. The more you concentrate on something, the more you think about it, the more detail you get about what you're thinking about. But at the same time, like a camera, is that when you focus a camera on a certain subject, that you're actually screening out the wider details. You're not so much aware of the warmth of the sand or the sun beating down, and you're not aware of the birds so much because they don't belong to the experience you're focused on. They're still there, and you're still in the presence of those things, but your awareness and your senses are now geared to what you're thinking about, which is the sandcastle. Now, when you build up your sandcastle, after a while you finish your sculpture and you're happy with it, and then you think, well, I'd like to go for a swim. And so what you do in that moment is that of thinking about the sandcastle, then you start thinking about going for a swim. And as you focus more on going for a swim, then the details about the sandcastle drift from your mind. Even though the sandcastle still exists on the beach, it's no longer your concern or your focus. Your focus is on having a fun time in the surf and going for a swim. And so you do all the things necessary to go and swim. And so this is where we this is the first trap we fall into, is that in terms of emotion and leading emotional lives that we do, getting caught up in emotional dramas, is that we're in a space of consciousness which is just open and expansive. Your senses are totally open. You're totally open to hearing the cars driving by and all of the sensory images and inputs that you're getting. You're open to these things. But as soon as you focus on a certain subject, then even though that information's there and you're in the presence of it, you no longer are receptive or responding to that. It's going in, but you're just not aware of it. You're aware of what you're focused on. Now, in that moment where we went from building a sandcastle to swimming, well, they're kind of thoughts. The thought of the sandcastle no longer captivated us because we'd changed our mind. And so we let go of that mental impression of the sandcastle and started sculpting a new impression, which was to go for a swim. And so we filled our experience became what it was like to be in the water, how cold the water was, the sand on the seabed, the waves, all of that information to do with the experience we were focused on having and concentrating on having was ours to experience. Even though that all exists in a larger context of the birds flying and the sun beating down. Like that's why we get sunburned often when we go to the beach, is because we're so focused on what we're doing, getting a tan, that we forget the wider context of what we're doing. And so in that time of letting go of one thought, the thought of the sandcastle, and then starting to feed or starting to build up the thought of swimming, there's a transition that we take, and it's an internal transition. Sure, physically we change from the actions of building a sandcastle, but we don't just go from one act to another. There's an internal changeover that needs to take place. In order for me to go from the movement and the action of creating a sandcastle to swimming, well, I've got to do something mentally. I've got to decide that, hang on a minute, I want to stop this and I want to start this. So it's really interesting how in just that simple example, how we limit our awareness. Our awareness is limited. Like while we're focusing on one thing, say we're focusing on the pineapple, the more we focus and the more we take in details about the pineapple, about how sweet it must be if you cut it open and the little thorns and the leaves, well, I'm not so much aware of what's going on around me. And that's just the way the mind works. It works like a camera, And that's the first mistake we make, is that we forget that the mind is designed to do a certain job and it works in a certain way. And if you go, if you don't understand the way your mind works, well, you can fall into potential difficulty. And in the example, it's like it's just a sandcastle and it's just a swim. They're both things that we've chosen to do. There's no emotional charge on them. We're free to come and go, and to maybe sunbake on the beach, or go for a walk along the beach, or pick up shells, or we can do whatever we want with the space. A few weeks ago we looked at the flower of choice. It was one of the flowers we were looking at, which is actually this one here. And the flower of choice talks about how consciously we have options. Like every one of us, in every moment we enter into, we have options. There's so many different things we can do with our time. There's so many different things you can do in this current moment. You could sing a song, you could tap dance, you could do whatever you like. Consciously you have options. And internally those options always exist. It doesn't matter what situation you step into, you do have different things you can do. But the problem comes along is when we start attaching emotional labels to things and what things mean. Certain options aren't available to us simply because we don't like the repercussions of acting in that way, or it's not polite to say this to that person, or I'm at work, I can't possibly indulge in this. So certain options we don't have access to simply because they're not, we judge them as not being relevant, or not being healthy for us, or not being good, or not being respectful, and that sort of thing. But internally, because we're just, at this particular point in time, we're just talking about thoughts and feelings. We haven't actually taken the material world or the physical world into account yet. Internally, you can go from one thought to another, or one action to another, and there's no repercussion whatsoever. Inside yourself is basically your thoughts. So that's another thing we commonly mistake. We commonly mistake the thing we're thinking about inside ourselves for the reality outside. We don't see that there's actually a difference, that the thing I'm consciously entertaining is just simply a thought in my mind. I'm not actually talking to that person, or I'm not actually doing anything externally. I'm working on the internal drawing board, so to speak. So, and the thoughts that I have is basically, it is very much just like sand. Every thought that I have is sand that I've sculptured into a form. Like if I start thinking about an elephant, and I start picturing what an elephant is, and I've come across elephants in books and movies and television and all that kind of thing. And the longer I think about an elephant, the more detail I get about the elephant. The tusks and maybe even the dust, on the plane that he walks along, and maybe the zebras in the background, and the trumpeting noise that he makes. And the more I sit and focus and concentrate on what an elephant is like, even though externally there is no elephant in this room, it starts becoming real. It seems real. It seems very real. Like I can almost get the texture of his hide, and all of the different things. The things he likes peanuts. And the more detail I sculpt into that sandcastle in my own mind, the more prone I am to mistaking that for the reality. There's no elephant in my mind. It's a thought. It's just the basic substance of consciousness you've sculpted into an elephant. And through your interaction, through your focus, and through your attention, you put layer upon layer upon layer of information and built up the image of an elephant. And the more information we give something, the more real it seems. And that's an amazing gift we have. It's like, even though I'm not in the presence of a lot of things, I can think about those things, and I can draw my own conclusions, and I can sculpt my own awareness into a form so I understand what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing. But how often do we do that? It's like, how often do we, like when we're dealing with everyday life, how often do we say, oh, this is a thought that I'm having a problem with? My emotion, the charge that I'm feeling is because of the way I'm thinking about something. No, we fly off into reaction. You said this, you've done this, you, and we as I said, we mistake the internal reality for the external. And because we live in an external world with textures and forms and sights and sounds and so many changes and so many things we've got to register and participate in, well, we really don't have that sort of time, that lag time to actually register, oh, hang on, this is just my thinking that's causing me the disturbance. You know, it's just the way I've thought about this situation or the way I perceive things. You know, there's not really an elephant there to get all, you know, it's the elephant I've sculpted in my mind. It's the sandcastle I've built up inside my own mind that's causing me the disturbance. But we live in a you blame world, you know, like we like to blame things on other people, you know, other things, and defer responsibility for what we're doing, you know. Every moment we're building sculptures, impressions about things, you know. And so that's why the practice, what we've been practicing in class, and the practice of presence, is to actually drop back into that space of just awareness, to realise that you're actually on a beach that runs for as far as the eye can see, and that you have choices in that environment. You're not bound to do anything, you're not conditioned to do anything, you're actually free to think and to be aware. You know, but what we generally do is, we looked at the flower of alignment a few weeks ago, and the flower of alignment, which is this one over here, it says that we've got basically the lesson is that we've got the ability to drift off and to you know, collect information from different sources like the internet, the news, television. Human beings have this wonderful ability to leave their body in one position and then mentally collect information. But the problem is, where we become unstuck is that we do so much travelling away from our actual selves and our actual experience that we never really come back. Like, we're so well practiced in leaving where we are that we never actually gather the information we need, come back to where we're at, and then take stock of where we're actually at. Come back to a neutral space of awareness, and a sense that, oh, I'm just watching a news bulletin, or I am doing this, and become completely aware of ourselves. Often we get drawn into the drama. You know, we see something, we get drawn into the drama, and then because we never actually come back to centre, we get drawn into another drama, and into another, and into another, and into another. And so we get caught up in our emotions. And that's how we sort of go around in these patterns of these cycles of emotion. We just keep going around and round in circles because we never actually come back to ourselves.